Hello, historians. Welcome back to lectures. I'm sure you're so excited. Chapter 19, Politics and Economics. I have my book open to the very first page. I see Nixon in China, experiencing Chinese food. It's an interesting thing that happens as a result of Nixon going to China. I'll tell this story while you're getting your book out and your notes ready to go. News cameras were really big on showing him experience in China. He's the first president to go to China. He opens up China. Whether or not you think that was a good thing or a bad thing, a little bit depends upon your party. A little bit depends on how you feel about globalization with manufacturing, for instance. Imagine what our life would be like if he didn't open China and we didn't have so many things made for cheaper prices made in China. But that's neither here nor there right now. So, news cameras were keen on catching Nixon eating Chinese food. And there had been Chinese restaurants in the United States since Chinese immigrants came, 1870s, 1880s. But for the most part, the only people who ate at these restaurants were the occasional cowboy 100 plus years ago and Chinese people who wanted the taste of food from home. But people saw Nixon eating this Chinese food and became intrigued. And this opened up a whole new market for Chinese restaurants. And pretty soon, Americans, Caucasians, were deciding to try Chinese food for the first time. So, if you would have grown up in the 50s or 60s, Chinese food would not be something you would have had on a regular basis. You wouldn't have had Mexican food on a regular basis either. Those restaurants would have really catered just to that demographic, that ethnic group of people. But now, I mean, think about how often you have Mexican food, unless you don't like it, every week, a couple times a week, maybe. And then if you think about how often you have Asian food, whether it's sushi or Chinese or something, your parents, your grandparents, especially your grandparents, if they don't like that type of ethnic food, it's because they didn't have it when they were kids. Nobody would have eaten food like that. No Caucasian middle class perfect little family in 1950s America, white America, would have had food like that unless they were of an immigrant family. And so Nixon opens up China for trade, starts to relax tensions during the Cold War, especially between the US and China. And hey, we eat Chinese food on a regular basis now because of Nixon's visit to China. So, chapter 19, you're doing section 1 and 2 for today, all about Nixon, his administration, and the Watergate scandal. Even though the book says 1971, we're going to start before then. We're going to start when Nixon becomes elected as president. And then you're going to read section 3 on Ford and Carter, which will get us through the 80s up until the election of Ronald Reagan. And what life in the 70s was like is what you'll read on Thursday. I'm sure I'll have a few stories. I might even show you a picture of me from the 70s. We'll see, because I was born in 1971. So I grew up, my formative childhood years were in the 70s. So I'm turning the page already, looking at section 1, and here we go with our slideshow, if it will work for me. There we go. So Nixon runs an interesting campaign. We had Johnson, who served 2 terms. He could have gone for a third just because he had his 10 years yet, because he came in the last year of Kennedy's presidency, finished that, had his whole next term, but then decided he didn't want to run for re-election. Vietnam was really wearing him down. The protests that were happening in the late 60s, the civil rights movement, Johnson was just tired. He was kind of done with being president. He had accomplished quite a bit. And so we have new candidates running. So no one's running for re-election in the election of 1968. And 1968, if you remember from the activity you did for Chapter 18 test, 1968 was a really rough year for the United States. There were a lot of protests. There was assassinations. MLK, Robert Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy. There was the Tet Offensive. There was the credibility gap that was beginning to happen between the American people and the government and the press basically is we didn't know what to believe anymore. The government said we're winning, and then we kept seeing bodies coming home from Vietnam. And so 1968 was a really rough year. We had a lot of violence inside the United States, or at least it felt that way. Crime was going up. And Vietnam, we weren't winning. And so Nixon promised some key stuff that middle America wanted to hear, that the silent majority of people wanted to hear. Keep in mind that as you looked at the counterculture stuff in chapter 18, there the hippies were a minority, like a minority of a minority. There weren't that many people who were these liberal hippies smoking pot, protesting, going to Woodstock. The majority of people were home, were working hard, were conservative, were Christian, and they felt like their voices weren't being heard. And Nixon worked on that. He figured out that middle America was very frustrated with what the state of the nation was in the 1960s, late 60s, how it felt like we were really going liberal, and he appealed to that. He promised peace with honor in Vietnam. Let's get out of Vietnam. Let's have peace with honor. Notice that doesn't say victory, but it does say peace with honor. We don't really get peace with honor, but he does get us out of Vietnam. Law and order at home, stop the protests, be tough on crime. Government, he kind of hinted that he would slow down some of the changes that Johnson had started, some of the civil rights changes, some of the changes with the size of government. He doesn't really do that, but he hints that he might. A return to more traditional families, mom, dad, kids together, enough with the divorce, enough with the single parents, back to how things used to be in the early 60s. I often talk about the long-haired Beatles and the short-haired Beatles. Yeah, I'm talking about the Beatles, the musical group. Let's go back to when the Beatles wore suits and had short haircuts, as opposed to the hippie Beatles that we saw in the late 60s, which were part of the transcendentalist movement, and they had long hair, they used drugs, they went to India and learned how to meditate. Let's go back to the clean-cut version of the Beatles is kind of what he was appealing to. So we had Nixon running as the Republican candidate, Hubert H. Humphrey from Minnesota, yay, as the Democratic candidate, and George Wallace. George Wallace wanted to reverse the civil rights movement, wanted to keep the African Americans down in the South. So, of course, he's going to get some of those votes of segregationalists. And so as we look at the election map, and the colors are reversed, so don't let that tweak your brain too much. It reversed from what you would see today. Nixon, the Republican candidate, should be colored red, but he's blue in this case. The Democratic candidate, Hubert H. Humphrey, got a fair amount of states in various locations. Not too surprising that there's Democratic votes up here. Minnesota's been Democratic for ages, and Hubert H. Humphrey was from Minnesota. And then Texas, for Texas to go Democrat, it's kind of interesting. Not what they usually go for anymore. And then the American Independent of Wallace wanting to keep roll back civil rights changes and keep segregation where it had been earlier in the 60s, of course getting a lot of votes in the Deep South. Nixon, as he was running, had kind of a Southern strategy, and it's really interesting what he does. He wanted to attract more Southern voters who tended already to be Democrat at this point in time. He met with Strom Thurmond, who was a senator from South Carolina, and Strom Thurmond ends up being a senator forever. Look into his career. He died a couple of years ago. But he met with this longstanding senator from South Carolina in order to promise to do certain things that would get Southern Democrats to turn and become Republicans, basically. And these were Southern Democrats who were frustrated with the civil rights movement, who favored a slowdown to the changes that were being brought through with the civil rights movement. So Strom Thurmond And Nixon worked out kind of a plan of getting more of these votes by appointing some conservatives to federal courts, ones that would not be so quick to uphold civil rights changes. He named a Southerner to the Supreme Court. He made a promise that he would oppose court-ordered busing. He doesn't really follow through on that. And he chose a vice president candidate that was an okay choice for Southerners, which was Spiro Agnew. That's who the picture is. He was the governor of Maryland at the time. After he became president, Nixon kind of at the beginning tries to slow down desegregation a little bit, but doesn't really get very far in it. It's not a wholehearted type of change. He just kind of tries to make the change to show that he followed through with some of these promises. But he does follow through with a bunch of law and order stuff. So we have a new Supreme Court Chief Justice, Warren Burger, takes over after Earl Warren, who was our Chief Justice through most of the 50s and the 60s. Remember, we talked about the Warren Court. Well, now we have the Burger Court. And so he replaces the Supreme Court Chief Justice. I don't remember if Earl Warren retires or if he dies. A little before, I was really paying attention to the Supreme Court, but we've got Warren Burger. Warren Burger's going to be Chief Justice for quite some time, actually. He appoints those federal judges that would slow down civil rights changes, just like he promised. He starts to enforce laws against protests and riots. He is tougher on crime, helping some people in the United States believe he's being tougher on crime in minority neighborhoods. And he vocally attacks certain Supreme Court decisions that expand the rights of accused criminals, which, remember, that's everything that the Warren Court did, or at least that's what it felt like. Was the Warren Court was very much there to protect the rights of people who were accused of crimes. Nixon's like, no, they're criminals. Don't give them the rights. Just prosecute them. Ironic, I know, but true. Also under Nixon, we're going to see a lot of other changes that are going to come through. Clean Water Act, Occupational Safety and Health Administration is created. The Clean Water Act is created. The Endangered Species Act. There's new airline and highway safety programs that are put into place as well. And so even though Nixon said he's not going to do a lot of the Great Society programs that Johnson did, he does quite a bit. His platform or his program is called New Federalism. Federalism is going to be a term that's going to refer to the separation of power between what the national government's responsible for and what the states are responsible for. This is really key right now as we think about COVID. You see the different layers of government doing different things. The city and county doing specific things that are, of course, very local. And then think about what kind of mandates, what kind of rules are coming at the state level. And then what the federal government is doing as a part of this crisis. The federal government's providing a lot of overall overarching guidelines, providing money and equipment, or at least they say they are, they're promising to, whereas the state is really focused just on the state, and that way the states can be open to focus just on what's best for their people. That's what federalism is all about, is the division of power and responsibilities between the federal government and the state governments. So Nixon's going to focus on turning some federally funded programs, though, that Johnson came up with, like Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, stuff like that, those types of programs, over to the states. And the states are going to have to figure out how to provide the funding for some of these programs, which would include like welfare programs. So at this point in time, the welfare system is going to go from being a federally funded, federally governed program to a state funded program, which is how you see some people have like the Oregon Trail debit cards. Essentially, they can use at stores. That's because that money is all state funded. The feds give some money for the programs, but the states come up with the rest of the money. Nixon also expands the power of the executive branch through some of those programs that I already mentioned. And he's going to he's one of the power presidents, okay? So I've talked about power presidents before. Johnson's a power president for sure. Nixon's a power president. Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln are all power presidents. They're ones that expand the office of president, expand the executive branch, expand what the president is able to do. Reagan is another one, and history is going to determine whether Trump is or not, depending on whether he's a two-termer or one-termer and the long-lasting effects of some of the things he's tried to do. When we say Nixon, we usually just go Watergate, Watergate, but really he has some great stuff. And if it wasn't for Watergate, he maybe would go down as being a really good president. Foreign policy is one place where he really shined. This is from an opera based on Nixon, who's always drawn with this pretty big crook nose, and Mao, and it's an opera that premiered in San Francisco. I don't remember how many years ago now, probably a decade or two, all about this event, basically, this visit between these two powerful men. But the key for Nixon's success in foreign policy was Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger had been our key foreign policy maker for a couple of different presidents, actually. He worked with Johnson extensively throughout the Vietnam War, and then he's going to work with Nixon also. So Kissinger is going to help negotiate a gradual withdrawal from Vietnam. If you remember from what you looked at Chapter 17, it doesn't really work out quite like how we thought it would work out. But eventually we do withdraw from Vietnam. And we take a less confrontational approach to this Cold War conflict that we have. With the Soviet Union, Nixon's able to, and with Kissinger's help, able to have a relaxing of tensions, and that word is called détente. It's a French term. We're going to talk about it more with Reagan. They encouraged the Soviets to be a little more diplomatic and not be so shoot from the hip. And then with China, he actually visited China. First president to do so, strengthened ties with the Chinese. This is going to start economic relationships with the Chinese, in which we're going to start to have import-export with them. Eventually, China will modernize to the effect that they become the industrial powerhouse that they have today. So this political cartoon, Brezhnev, excuse me, and Nixon under mistletoe, isn't that cute? So then there's Moscow in May of 1972. An amazing talk. SALT I happens. We're going to talk about SALT II later in the 70s. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Let's not have so many nuclear weapons that we can blow up the planet like 7 times over. Okay, let's limit it. They increased trade, exchange scientific information. Let's help each other. So this relaxed Cold War tensions for a while. It's not going to last permanently, but it's going to be good for a while at least. All right, here we go. Watergate. There's some great stuff out there on Watergate. I put in the YouTube channel an excerpt from a movie called Frost Nixon, which the whole movie I think is absolutely fascinating, but at your age I'm not so sure I would have. Watch out, there's quite a few F-bombs in it. But if you can watch it, I think you can watch it in pieces on YouTube or get it from a rental site. But it's fascinating. It's about this British journalist who, after all of this happens, gets Nixon to admit some of the stuff that actually happened, the stuff that Nixon denies at the time. And so I don't even know where to begin. There's so much I can say about this. So the Watergate scandal. The Watergate was an apartment building / hotel in Washington, D.C. For those of you who've been on your D.C. trip, you may have driven by it and may not have realized you drove by it unless your tour guide said something about it. It's really close to the Kennedy Center for the Arts. It's along the river. It's a beautiful location. And it just depends on what roads you're driving on, whether or not you go past the Watergate. But the Watergate Hotel or office complex housed the re-election or the election campaign offices for George McGovern, who was running against Nixon for the 1972 election. Nobody really believed McGovern was going to be much of a threat to Nixon. He had a pretty high popularity rating. He had done these great foreign policy changes. He was getting us out of Vietnam. He was getting peace at home. Nobody really worried about it, but Nixon was very paranoid. And so what history can't decide with yet is whether or not Nixon knew at the time that his creep members, the committee to re-elect the president, if he knew in advance or as it happened that the creep members went in probably to plant bugs, listening devices, in the election headquarters for McGovern. But they do, and they get caught. Now, if you've seen Forrest Gump, it's Forrest Gump who calls it in. Of course, it's not Forrest Gump because Forrest Gump is fictional. But anyway, they get caught, and Nixon's going to deny it. He's going to say that he doesn't know that it happened, that he didn't find out about it until well after the fact. But what we're eventually going to find with going back and listening to tapes from the Oval Office is that he knew early enough that he moved money around in order to try to cover it up. So whether he asked for it to happen, I don't think he did actually. Whether he knew it was happening at the time, I don't think he did. But whether he knew almost immediately afterwards, that's where I think he probably did. But they kept it pretty quiet for a while. So here's a good little timeline that shows you how the whole thing kind of happens. In June of 72, 5 men break into that Democratic National Headquarters. In April of 73, already Nixon denies that he knew about it. Meanwhile, we had already had elections. So it was the election of 1972. So in November of 1972, Nixon wins by a landslide. McGovern was no threat for him. January 20th of 1973, he would have been sworn in for his second term. It wasn't until April that everything's kind of starts percolating to the point where Nixon's got to pay some attention to it. So in April of 73, he denies that he knew anything about the break-in. By May of 73, a Senate committee starts investigating this. In June, former Nixon aide tells the committee that Nixon approved the cover-up. Nixon approved the cover-up. He provided funds. He stopped the FBI from investigating the guys who did the break-in. He did a whole bunch of stuff. In August of 1974, Nixon is forced to release tapes of Oval Office conversations that prove his role in the cover-up. It's a Supreme Court case. It's Nixon versus the United States versus Nixon. It's 1974. I don't remember which one's listed first right now. And they said, you have to provide these tapes. We have subpoenaed the tapes. We have subpoenaed you. And he's like, no. Executive privilege. The president gets to keep some things private. And the court's like, not unless it's a national security issue. And it's not. You're lying. And so he tried claiming executive privilege. The Supreme Court said nope, so he hands over the tapes, but the tapes have blank parts. They have stuff that's recorded over accidentally. They don't know how it happened. And pretty soon, before you know it, the House of Representatives starts to draw up impeachment charges. Articles of impeachment is what they're called. And then Nixon realizes he's got to resign. Spiro Agnew had already resigned because of tax fraud issues. I posted an activity for you to look at. You just have to do it by Friday, about Nixon's search for a new vice president. The way it's written is if something happens to the president gets to appoint a new vice president, and it just has to be approved, I think, by like a Senate vote. And so Nixon was asking for advice. So make sure you do that activity, looking at a secondary source and a primary source about the replacement for Spiro Agnew. But the evidence is found and gets the president. He resigns on August 9th, 1974, continuing to assert that he's not a crook. Gerald Ford, who was the vice president selected by Nixon, is sworn in the next day. He's the only president to serve as president who had never been elected to the position of president or vice president. The YouTube video that's shown right there, if you wanted to look for it, I believe it's of Nixon resigning from the presidency. So if we were doing a traditional test, it certainly looks like this would be one of the essays for the test. We're not doing a traditional test. I haven't decided how I'm going to do this test yet, so it doesn't mean that this won't come up. It might. I'm not quite sure. I haven't decided how I'm going to test you yet on chapter 19 and 20, but there's a lot of things that happen because of Watergate. here's what I recommend that you do, because there's 3 of these slides, I think. I'm going to hit upon a few things. I want you to pause, read through them, and understand. Here's the sad part about Watergate. We um, we already had the credibility gap. We already had where we weren't trusting the federal government as much as we did in the 50s and early 60s. And this just kind of puts a nail in the coffin for the credibility of the office of president, the respect that the office of president is supposed to get. This changes how government functions. It makes a whole bunch of rules necessary for government ethics. Some of these were probably long overdue. We've had scandals in Congress since day one, really. We've had presidents do shady things, abuse their power since maybe not George Washington, but definitely John Adams with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and probably Washington too, especially if you aren't a big fan of Washington. And so these things finally end up on the books to try to provide transparency in the government. We know what's going on. There's a code of ethics now for congressional members on they can't take bribes, and they can't take gifts, and it limits speaking fees if they do speaking engagements and stuff like that. It made changes for federal campaign contributions and had Freedom of Information Act, which enables you to access government papers, put in a request and access government papers. And so a whole bunch of different things happen because of Watergate. So I'm about to change the slide, but if you need to pause to read through these, you can pause and read through these. And then if you have any questions, you can come to open office hours later or send me an email and I can answer. So we've got a special prosecutor provision, which this special prosecutor provision is going to be key in upcoming impeachments of the impeachment of Clinton and the impeachment of Trump also. We're going to have different allowances given to the FBI. Remember, the FBI tends to function within the United States. The CIA functions in other countries. But they do kind of the same sort of stuff. Just the FBI is within the borders of the United States for the most part, and the CIA is outside of. But there's going to be new allowances given to them, but there's also going to be new changes regarding wiretaps and privacy issues and gathering intelligence and who gets access to that intelligence, who gets to do that intelligence, all that sort of stuff. There's also disclosure acts, again, for transparency in the government so that we better understand what the government is up to, not only the government itself, but individuals in government positions. And then to get away from all of the rules and the laws and the acts, like I already mentioned, distrust of the president and his office of president. Government's corrupt is how a lot of people are going to walk away from this. For the people who didn't like Johnson and all of his liberal reforms, they already didn't like the government. And then we have Nixon, who comes in as a conservative, and he screws things up too. The media is going to no longer blindly support the president. They're going to be far more critical. That starts during Vietnam, though. We're going to see protection for whistleblowers. A big part of how this blows up is through people who spoke out. And so we're going to see people who speak out in the future and how hopefully they're protected a little bit. Although whistleblowers, it's still a risky thing, but it's the right thing to do. We now have investigative journalism. We had a little bit of that with Vietnam, but now we're going to see it even more, where reporters are going to just dig deep for information. And that's how this whole Nixon thing really kind of blows up. Proved the rule of law is what it's called, to use a government term. Rules and laws apply to the president too, and he cannot say they don't. So again, to go back to that Frost-Nixon video, that's the video that I showed, that I'm showing you. And I prefer to show you the Hollywood version as opposed to the actual version, although you can see the actual version online too of the real Nixon talking with the real Frost. But I like the Hollywood version a little bit better because they cut out some unnecessary dialogue and get right to the point. But Nixon says, when I'm president, I believe that the rules don't apply to me, but I now realize not everybody feels the same way. And it's a really, that's not exactly how he phrases it, but it's a really powerful moment. You really need to watch that like 3.5 minute long clip from Frost Nixon. It weakens the US internationally, just makes us look kind of stupid, and that our president is a crook, and we already know that there were presidents that were crooks in other countries, and it's going to lower us to the standing of some of those Eastern European countries or Latin American countries. And then we're going to add gate on for other political scandals. So there's going to be a couple different gates that are going to pop up in the Clinton administration, and then you heard Deflate Gate with a Super Bowl. That wasn't even a political scandal, it was just a scandal. And so we're going to see that suffix of gate that's going to show up on some stuff. I think this is the last slide for this one. And I've learned it takes a moment for it to forward. Oh, yay, political cartoons. So we have some political cartoons from this. I like this one up here, playing upon the Titanic, right? Who's responsible for all these leaks is what the quote at the top says. It's Nixon in like an admiral or a captain type of uniform. HMS Watergate is going down fast. A gate or a dam that's flooding all over the place. Nixon's holding on to the top of the White House to the flag for dear life. This one is my favorite one, though. I am not a crook, alluding to the parts of the tapes from the Oval Office conversations that were deleted. I just think that one is incredibly clever. And then this one has the names of all these guys who were around Nixon helping to protect him, and notice how they're all pointing, no, it was him, no, it was him, no, it was him, no, it was him, no, it was him. They're all kind of alluding or pointing to someone next to them. It was somebody else. If you watch that Frost Nixon excerpt, you're going to see him refer to these two guys. G. Gordon Liddy, if you watch the video of Nixon on trial, that I also posted on the YouTube page. The bald lawyer for Nixon is Liddy. And then Magruder, I think he also, Nixon mentions Magruder in the video excerpt that I want you to watch too. And there we go. The end of Nixon. I hate covering him so quickly. He's absolutely fascinating. We'll talk about Ford and Carter and what life was like to be a little kid in the 70s on Thursday.